In the quiet town of rural Illinois, 1927, a shadow lay over the fields and forests, one that the local townsfolk could not name yet instinctively feared. It was here, in a nondescript collection of wooden houses and narrow lanes, that a secretive sect emerged, an enigmatic assembly of individuals who rejected conventional life and embraced a ritual so unsettling that even whispers of it seemed to curdle the air. The leader, known only as Elias Cranston, exuded an aura of calm authority, his eyes dark with intent, moving among his followers like a conductor orchestrating a silent symphony of devotion and dread. The cult's peculiarity was not immediately apparent to outsiders. They gathered for prayer, they ate, they spoke, they dressed like any ordinary community. But the true horror, the element that would define their legacy, remained hidden. At night, each member would retire to a coffin in which they slept, a choice both literal and symbolic, blurring the line between life, death, and devotion. It began subtly. Elias preached a philosophy that combined asceticism, spiritual purification, and the embrace of mortality as a tool for enlightenment. Followers, drawn by promises of transcendence and eternal unity, surrendered their homes, their belongings, and ultimately their bodies to the practices he endorsed. To the casual observer, this was eccentricity. To those who dared listen closely, the rituals hinted at an intensity that bordered on obsession. There were no banners, no dramatic ceremonies in public, only the quiet discipline of a group committed to living within the confines of wooden enclosures that mimicked graves. Neighbors occasionally glimpsed members emerging from their dwellings with pale, hollow-eyed expressions, their movements deliberate, almost rehearsed, as if the boundary between sleep and waking had dissolved entirely. Rumors began to circulate. Children told of friends' older siblings vanishing into the night, returning with strange expressions and a silent reverence. Farmers passing by the property noticed coffins stacked in sheds and barns, and at first dismissed it as morbid storage, until the realization that these were not mere props, but actual sleeping quarters dawned upon them. There was a palpable chill in the air when entering the vicinity, a subtle tension that refused explanation. Townspeople reported uneasy sensations, an instinctive understanding that this community operated under rules both human and otherworldly. Elias Cranston's charisma was central to the cult's power. He spoke with quiet conviction, his words measured yet compelling, weaving a narrative of mortality as liberation. "Sleep in the coffin and awaken to truth," he would whisper during sermons, his followers nodding in absolute obedience. Observers, when they managed to hear him, described a disarming calm in his voice, one that made questioning impossible, even for those who sensed a creeping unease. In private journals, some residents speculated whether this was sheer devotion or a psychological manipulation that preyed on fear and longing for purpose. Either way, the cult's practices soon attracted attention beyond the immediate neighbors, hinting at the unnerving possibility of a broader influence. The horror of the narrative, however, was not in the act itself, but in its subtleties, the way ordinary routines intersected with extraordinary discipline. Members rose in the early morning, walked among the living with apparent normalcy, yet returned to coffins at night without complaint, without hesitation, as if the wooden enclosures were beds rather than reminders of mortality. To outsiders, this juxtaposition created a cognitive dissonance. How could a human being appear so functional while engaging in such a macabre lifestyle? The answer, it seemed, lay in the unyielding authority of Elias and the complex social dynamics of submission, fear, and ritual. The townsfolk, at first intrigued, grew wary. A farmer passing by one of the cottages recounted the peculiar smell of damp earth mingling with candle wax, a combination that unsettled even the most pragmatic of men. Women reported seeing figures kneeling over coffins at odd hours, heads bowed in fervent prayer, while others whispered of shadows moving without visible source. Children described stories of secret tunnels connecting dwellings, pathways only known to members, and windows that never reflected light in a normal fashion. Each anecdote layered upon the last, building an atmosphere of quiet terror, a sense that the natural order had been subtly but irrevocably disrupted. Investigative journalists from nearby towns began visiting, often under the guise of casual inquiry, but soon recognized that the community resisted scrutiny. Conversations were polite, superficially cordial, yet always controlled. The cult's members seemed attuned to the smallest shifts in attention, ready to redirect inquiries with calm deflection or philosophical reasoning. There were no overt threats, no violence, only the weight of observation and a subtle assertion of dominance that suggested consequences far more severe than mere reprimand. Psychologists and sociologists, writing retrospectively decades later, would note the intriguing combination of authoritarian leadership, isolation, and ritualized mortality practices. They speculated on the neurological and social effects of sleeping in coffins, describing possible impacts on circadian rhythms, perception of space, and psychological resilience or fragility. Yet in 1927, such insights were unavailable to the residents of Illinois. The community experienced the cult as an anomaly, a tangible disruption to daily life, but one shrouded in calm exterior, making its presence more insidious and unnerving. As the story of Elias Cranston and his followers grew, fascination mingled with dread. The cult was not sensationalized in newspapers. Its horror was quiet, embedded in routine, in disciplined silence, in the deliberate inversion of life and death. It was a horror without spectacle, one that gnawed at the mind through subtle suggestion, a slow unraveling of perceived normalcy. By the time outsiders fully understood the extent of the ritualized coffin sleeping, the psychological imprint had already taken hold, a quiet, persistent fear that lingered in anyone who approached too closely, a memento of the human capacity for devotion, obedience, and the unsettling allure of mortality embraced as daily practice. The hook, then, is the tension between surface normality and hidden terror, the calm faces of individuals who embraced a macabre ritual, the small-town observation that something was amiss yet could not be fully articulated, and the enigmatic leadership that guided the practice with unshakable authority. It is a story of ordinary humans performing extraordinary acts under the guise of faith, discipline, and secrecy, a narrative designed to draw the audience in, to make them question what they accept as normal, and to confront the silent horror that lies just beneath the surface of everyday life. Illinois in the 1920s was a landscape in transition, balancing the residual traditions of rural America with the rapid social changes of the early 20th century. Small towns dotted the landscape, connected by dirt roads and modest rail lines, yet isolated enough to cultivate tight-knit communities where shared belief and collective vigilance shaped daily life. In these towns, social hierarchy was defined not only by wealth but by moral reputation, family lineage, and adherence to local norms. Outsiders were viewed with suspicion, and unconventional behavior could quickly draw attention, judgment, or even ostracism. It was within this context that Elias Cranston's cult emerged, exploiting the unique combination of rural isolation, cultural conservatism, and communal curiosity. The aftermath of World War I had left many Americans unsettled, grappling with societal shifts, economic instability, and a pervasive sense of existential unease. In Illinois, communities were simultaneously anxious and introspective, seeking meaning and stability in a rapidly changing world. Religious revivalism and small sects were not uncommon, often providing psychological security and social structure to individuals navigating uncertainty. Elias Cranston's teachings fit neatly into this milieu, offering a disciplined path, a promise of transcendence, and a framework for understanding life and death in a society wrestling with post-war disillusionment. Daily life in these rural towns followed predictable rhythms, work in fields or factories, communal gatherings at churches or town halls, and seasonal events that punctuated the calendar. Yet beneath this surface of ordinariness, there existed fertile ground for psychological and social experimentation. Human curiosity, combined with social isolation, made residents acutely aware of deviation from accepted norms. In such a setting, the presence of a small group practicing extreme rituals, sleeping in coffins, observing nocturnal ceremonies, withdrawing from mainstream activities, was both noticeable and unnerving. The subtlety of the cult's actions allowed it to operate within the community, yet its very difference created unease that permeated consciousness. The economic conditions of the era also influenced the emergence of unconventional communities. Agricultural mechanization had begun to alter traditional livelihoods, creating periods of both surplus and scarcity. Families often faced uncertainty regarding income, health, and survival, which made them receptive to alternative explanations for fortune, misfortune, and the structure of life itself. Cults and sects offered not only spiritual guidance but practical solutions: communal living, shared labor, and rituals that promised protection, prosperity, or clarity of purpose. Cranston's group leveraged these anxieties, presenting coffin sleeping as a method of purification and resilience, a symbolic act aligned with the values of discipline and survival that resonated in a rural, economically precarious society. Cultural attitudes toward death, mortality, and ritual were particularly relevant. Post-Civil War America had maintained a fascination with mourning, cemetery aesthetics, and posthumous commemoration. Funerary rituals were elaborate and socially significant, emphasizing respect for the dead and acknowledgement of mortality. In this context, the act of sleeping in coffins could be interpreted as a radical extension of existing cultural practices, a literal and symbolic engagement with mortality designed to cultivate spiritual clarity and detachment from worldly concerns. While extreme, the ritual drew upon familiar imagery and established social preoccupations, making it both provocative and, in a strange sense, comprehensible to observers steeped in contemporary norms. Education and literacy also played a role in shaping the community's reception of the cult. Most townsfolk had access to basic schooling, fostering literacy sufficient to engage with newspapers, pamphlets, and religious texts. Yet critical analysis of unconventional practices was limited by prevailing social assumptions. This mixture of awareness and naivety allowed the cult's philosophical and ritual claims to circulate without immediate skepticism, while simultaneously attracting attention due to subtle inconsistencies or behavioral anomalies. Oral tradition and anecdotal storytelling amplified these effects, creating layers of narrative in which the cult's actions were interpreted, misinterpreted, and mythologized. Psychological factors contributed further to the context. The early 20th century saw a nascent understanding of mental health, neurology, and social psychology, but the concepts of group influence, ritual behavior, and altered circadian cycles remained largely unformalized. Communities relied on observation, anecdote, and moral reasoning to interpret unusual behavior. Thus, the cult's practice of coffin sleeping, isolating, repetitive, and nocturnally focused, produced a sense of foreboding that could not be easily rationalized. It challenged the community's expectations, merging fear, fascination, and the uncanny in a single, persistent tableau. Finally, the spatial layout of rural Illinois provided both concealment and proximity. Dense woodlands, barns, and outbuildings allowed for the construction of secretive spaces where the cult could practice without immediate scrutiny, while the small-town grid ensured that neighbors would remain aware of comings and goings, albeit with limited understanding. This tension between visibility and concealment amplified suspense. Outsiders could sense difference, but the precise nature of the rituals remained hidden, heightening the psychological impact of the cult's presence. In summary, the social, cultural, and environmental conditions of 1920s Illinois created fertile ground for the emergence of Elias Cranston's cult. Economic uncertainty, cultural engagement with death, limited psychological understanding, rural isolation, and strong communal observation all combined to create a landscape in which unconventional practices could flourish while simultaneously generating fear, fascination, and persistent narrative tension. This historical framework allows us to understand the context in which the members of the cult that slept in coffins operated, providing a backdrop that makes their practices both comprehensible and haunting to modern observers. The story of the cult that slept in coffins was not built in a single night. It unfolded in a series of quiet, unnerving incidents that gradually revealed the depth of their devotion and the edge of human fear. The first significant event occurred on a cold autumn evening when a local farmer, passing by the Cranston property, noticed a peculiar glow through a barn window. At first glance, it appeared to be candlelight, but the arrangement was unusual. Rectangular wooden boxes, each with a lid slightly ajar, lined in perfect order, their interiors illuminated with flickering flames. The farmer's curiosity overcame caution, and he peered through a crack in the wall. What he saw briefly was enough to haunt him. Pale figures lying motionless within the coffins, their faces calm, eyes closed. The semblance of sleep transforming ordinary mortals into something almost spectral. Weeks later, children reported strange sounds at night, low hums, whispers, and the occasional thud that seemed to originate from the ground itself. Parents dismissed these initially as wind or animals, yet the consistency and timing grew more troubling. One evening, a young boy wandered too close to the barn and glimpsed the ritual firsthand. A member, noticing the child, rose silently from a coffin and approached without uttering a word. The boy froze, and the figure returned to the box as silently as it had emerged, leaving an indelible mark of dread in the child's mind. Stories spread through whispers at school, each retelling adding subtle exaggerations, the soft scraping of wood, the barely perceptible scent of candle wax and earth, the unnerving stillness that lingered even after the observer had left. As the community adjusted to this strange presence, more dramatic incidents occurred. One night, a fire broke out in the outer shed used for the rituals, likely caused by the excessive use of candles near wooden structures. The followers reacted with a startling combination of calm and precision. They removed their bodies from the coffins and formed a human chain, transferring sacred texts and ritual implements to safety before firefighters arrived. The spectacle left witnesses both awed and terrified. Here were humans entirely committed to a practice that appeared macabre, yet executed with discipline and unity that bordered on the unnatural. The incident reinforced the sense that their devotion was absolute, their adherence to ritual a form of quiet, sustained horror. In another event, a traveling journalist attempted to interview Elias Cranston. The journalist described entering a darkened house where the air was thick with the mingled scent of wood smoke and wax. Cranston spoke softly, explaining the spiritual significance of resting in coffins, of embracing mortality as a conscious act. The journalist noted the near-hypnotic calm of the followers, each seated with hands folded, their eyes fixed on the leader. When pressed about safety and mental health, Cranston's response was measured. To know the bounds of life, one must understand the embrace of death each night. Fear is the mind's guardian, but faith is its liberator. The journalist left unnerved, documenting a scene that appeared surreal yet entirely composed, a calculated blending of human psychology and ritualized symbolism. Physical incidents also punctuated the narrative. On one occasion, a young member misjudged the space of a coffin, slipping and sustaining a minor injury to the wrist. While the wound was medically minor, the reaction was socially significant. The other members moved with synchronized urgency, lifting and stabilizing the injured individual without alarm. This coordinated response was itself disconcerting to outside observers, who could not discern whether the calm was born of compassion, discipline, or a chilling detachment from ordinary human emotion. The incident emphasized the group's cohesion and the psychological conditioning that underpinned their practices, transforming a mundane accident into a moment of dramatic tension. Neighbors occasionally noted strange nocturnal rituals, chants, the faint tapping of wood, synchronized breathing that coincided with the coffin sleeping. One evening, a widow walking her dog reported seeing shadows moving unnaturally in the barn windows, glimpses of heads tilting in unison, limbs unmoving except for subtle breathing. The effect was hypnotic, creating an impression of life and death coexisting in a suspended state. These observations, when shared with others, became central to the lore of the cult, emphasizing the psychological and atmospheric manipulation implicit in their practices. In winter, when nights were longest and frost coated the barn roofs, the ritual intensified. Candles reflected off icy surfaces, amplifying shadows and creating the impression that coffins were not just containers but portals. The followers, clad in identical garments, emerged at precise intervals for ritual prayers, their movements slow and deliberate. Outsiders, peering from a distance, described the scene as dreamlike yet profoundly unsettling, a choreographed sequence that blurred the line between devotion and something far darker. The silent obedience of participants, coupled with the physical constraints of sleeping in confined wooden boxes, created an atmosphere that modern observers might recognize as a form of extreme stress conditioning, blending fear, discipline, and ritualized isolation. Subtle incidents of interpersonal tension within the cult added to the narrative drama. Disagreements over placement of coffins, timing of rituals, or the allocation of candles produced small but highly charged confrontations. Observers from outside could not fully perceive the content of these disputes. Yet the intensity of interactions, coupled with the otherwise disciplined calm, suggested the presence of underlying psychological pressures. The juxtaposition of serene ritual with interpersonal strain highlighted the human complexity beneath the cult's frightening exterior, revealing that devotion did not erase fear, doubt, or conflict. It merely contained it within a controlled framework. Finally, one of the most disturbing series of incidents involved the nocturnal disappearance of an elder member for several hours. The town speculated wildly, imagining all manner of dark acts, from supernatural encounters to covert burials. In reality, the member had been conducting a private vigil in a remote coffin in the woods, testing the limits of endurance and psychological resilience. Yet the town's perception transformed the incident into a myth of terror, amplifying the cult's notoriety. Children whispered tales of the forest, sleepers, neighbors avoided the property at night, and the story of the cult evolved from observation into legend. Each of these incidents, individually and collectively, created a sustained atmosphere of suspense and unease. The combination of ritualized action, disciplined obedience, and visible but opaque practices produced a narrative that entranced observers while unsettling them. Minor accidents, nocturnal appearances, and the interplay of shadows and candlelight magnified the sense of horror. Importantly, these events illustrate the subtle horror of psychological manipulation, social cohesion, and human adaptability, the tension between external normalcy and internal extremity that defined the life of the cult. The incidents also highlight a critical interplay between observer and observed. Fear was not only produced by the actions of the cult, but also by the perception of difference, the recognition of patterns that defied ordinary explanation. Each misstep, faint sound, or unexpected movement became amplified, feeding the narrative of horror and ensuring that the story persisted beyond the immediate moment. The incidents of daily life, accidents, and ritual practices merged into a cohesive tableau, demonstrating how ordinary human behavior, when framed within extraordinary circumstances, can evoke profound psychological tension, fascination, and terror. The presence of the cult that slept in coffins did not remain a quiet curiosity for long. In the surrounding town, families, neighbors, and community leaders began responding with a mix of fascination, fear, and moral concern. Conversations in kitchens and along dirt roads were dominated by speculation. Why would anyone choose such a thing? Is it safe? What does it mean for the soul? Each question reflected not only curiosity but also the cultural and psychological lens through which the townspeople interpreted the unfamiliar. The ritual of sleeping in coffins challenged existing norms of domestic life, religious practice, and social expectation, creating a ripple of unease across households that had previously been accustomed to predictable routines. Families with children were particularly sensitive to the cult's practices. Parents worried about the potential influence of these rituals on young minds, sharing stories of glimpsed shadows or murmurs in the night. Some children reported nightmares or anxiety after passing the Cranston property, and parents were forced to reconcile their fear with societal norms of curiosity and education. In some cases, families moved temporarily or restricted travel near the property, reflecting both protective instinct and subtle social ostracism. Others, however, expressed morbid fascination, recounting the behaviors of cult members in exaggerated anecdotes that further fueled the town's sense of quiet terror. Medical professionals and doctors in the region were equally intrigued and unsettled. Dr. Harlan, a local physician, documented the physical effects of coffin sleeping on the cult members, noting pale complexions, slight emaciation, and unusual postures resulting from constrained spaces. While none of the injuries were life-threatening, he speculated on the potential long-term consequences: muscle atrophy, restricted circulation, sleep disruption, and psychological stress. Dr. Harlan's notes reveal a tension between scientific curiosity and ethical concern. He observed the phenomena with professional detachment, while grappling privately with the moral and existential implications of adults willingly submitting to potentially harmful routines. These observations would later provide a foundation for early studies on ritualized isolation and psychological adaptation. Religious authorities also weighed in, often condemning the cult while struggling to frame their critique within theological understanding. Reverend Samuel Kearns, whose church was within walking distance of the Cranston property, preached sermons that simultaneously warned of spiritual corruption and urged compassion for misguided souls. His messages emphasized discernment, framing the cult's practices as a deviation from God's design, yet acknowledging that curiosity and questioning were natural human tendencies. Parishioners absorbed these lessons in varied ways. Some adopted a cautious distance, while others used the sermons to reinforce communal identity and moral boundaries. The interplay of condemnation, moral reasoning, and social regulation contributed to a complex community response, blending fear, fascination, and reflection. Neighbors reported subtle interactions with cult members, often brief but laden with tension. A farmer attempting casual conversation about harvests was met with polite but evasive answers. A local shopkeeper noted the quiet, deliberate movements of cult members in public spaces. These encounters created a sense of omnipresent observation. The town perceived that cult members were aware of scrutiny, yet unconcerned, enforcing an implicit boundary that amplified unease. This dynamic of silent surveillance and controlled disclosure contributed to the mystique, reinforcing the impression that the cult operated according to rules beyond ordinary comprehension. Newspapers began covering the phenomenon. Although early reports were cautious, often framed as human interest stories rather than sensational exposés, journalists described the ritualized sleeping, the visible pallor of members, and the eerie quiet of the compound. Yet they also emphasized discipline, spiritual purpose, and apparent contentment among participants. These reports were double-edged. They validated public curiosity while simultaneously heightening apprehension. Readers were confronted with the juxtaposition of mundane daily activity and extraordinary nocturnal ritual, producing a sustained cognitive tension that shaped collective perception. Psychological interpretations, though primitive by modern standards, were often implicit in conversations. Observers speculated on obedience, fear of authority, and the allure of transcendence. Some noted the role of peer influence. The cohesion of the group was such that individual hesitation seemed unlikely, and conformity appeared enforced both socially and psychologically. Others considered the effect of environmental isolation. The cult's compound was surrounded by woods and open fields, providing both concealment and a sense of inevitability, as if those who approached were drawn into a predetermined narrative. These reflections highlight an early understanding of social psychology, ritual influence, and group dynamics, even if not formalized scientifically at the time. Letters to editors and public commentary reveal additional layers of concern. Citizens debated the appropriateness of public intervention versus personal autonomy, considering the balance between curiosity, moral obligation, and fear. Some advocated for law enforcement involvement, citing potential dangers or societal corruption, while others argued for observation without interference, emphasizing the right of adults to govern their own spiritual lives. This dialectic illustrates the broader societal struggle between individual freedom and communal norms, a tension that amplified both attention and anxiety surrounding the cult. In sum, the community's reaction was multidimensional: families protective of children, doctors analyzing physical and psychological impacts, clergy framing spiritual implications, neighbors observing subtle anomalies, journalists documenting with care, and public discourse debating morality and safety. The cult's quiet, controlled rituals produced an outsized response precisely because the horror was understated, persistent, and psychologically resonant. The presence of the coffins, the disciplined nocturnal behavior, and the enigmatic authority of Elias Cranston ensured that ordinary life was constantly juxtaposed against extraordinary, unsettling practices. Through these combined reactions, the cult achieved a paradoxical influence. It remained contained yet omnipresent, known yet enigmatic, terrifying yet compelling. Residents were forced to reconcile observation with interpretation, curiosity with fear, and reality with the faint whispers of legend. In doing so, the community itself became part of the narrative, an active participant in the unfolding psychological and cultural tension. The story of the cult that slept in coffins was not merely about ritual. It was about the interplay between human behavior, social perception, and the enduring allure of the mysterious. The night of the cult's most dramatic confrontation began quietly, as many nights did, with the fog rolling in from the surrounding fields, cloaking the Cranston property in a pall of gray silence. Candles flickered in the windows of the wooden cottages, their light casting elongated shadows on frost-kissed walls, while the distant hoot of an owl punctuated the stillness. The air itself seemed charged, taut with anticipation, as though the night held its breath in recognition of the events about to unfold. Elias Cranston had called for a full assembly, citing a special ritual to mark the culmination of their annual observances, and every member understood the significance. This night would test their devotion, endurance, and the fragile boundaries between life and symbolic death. Inside the main hall, the followers lined the room with measured precision. Wooden coffins, previously confined to the barns, were brought together in rows, forming a labyrinthine grid of contained bodies. Each individual moved with quiet reverence, carrying ritual implements, candles, small incense burners, and sacred texts that had been handled and preserved with almost obsessive care. The tension was visible in the subtle shifting of hands, the suppressed inhalations, and the fixed gazes of members toward Cranston, whose presence dominated the room with an uncanny calm. He spoke no words at first. The silence was complete, save for the occasional scrape of wood against floorboards, the faint whisper of fabric, the soft, controlled breathing of humans poised between vigilance and surrender. Suddenly, the ritual commenced. Cranston moved down the central aisle, tapping each coffin in precise succession, signaling the followers to enter their spaces. One by one, the members lay down, closing the lids above them, creating a vast field of confined humanity. Outside observers, who had gathered in secret, described the chilling effect. The house seemed to pulse with synchronized breathing, the living and the contained moving as one organism, and the boundary between individual and collective dissolved into a shared, almost inhuman rhythm. The air thickened with wax, incense, and the psychological weight of concentrated expectation. The night's tension escalated when a young initiate, inexperienced in coffin discipline, began to panic. His breathing grew rapid, his hands clawed at the wood, producing sharp noises that echoed through the hall like distant gunshots. The panic threatened to cascade through the room, potentially disrupting the ritual, but Cranston intervened without raising his voice. Moving with precise authority, he leaned close to the coffin, placing a hand on the lid. "Breathe with the rhythm," he whispered, almost imperceptibly, and gradually the young follower's agitation subsided. Witnesses would later describe this moment as surreal, the control exerted over one human being, the complete absorption of will into another's presence, produced a quiet terror greater than any visible violence. A second incident intensified the scene. A candle tipped in the labyrinth of coffins, threatening to ignite the carefully arranged wood. In ordinary circumstances, fire in a confined space would have triggered panic, but the members reacted with methodical calm. They formed coordinated chains, extinguishing flames, moving coffins with precise care, and preserving the integrity of the ritual. The juxtaposition of potential chaos and meticulous order amplified the psychological tension for all who observed. Outsiders felt the oppressive weight of control, while insiders experienced the heightened stakes of spiritual commitment and obedience. Midnight approached, and Cranston initiated the final sequence of the ritual, a symbolic awakening in which members would slowly emerge from coffins in unison, representing rebirth and transcendence. The synchronization was mesmerizing. Each lid lifted, each body rose, moving in perfect cadence. Eyes met eyes. Faces remained expressionless, yet the energy in the room was palpable, almost electric. Observers described an uncanny spectacle, as though watching the physical manifestation of a collective consciousness, a single entity expressed through the bodies of many. The event was terrifying, not in explicit action, but in the uncanny precision and the emotional intensity of disciplined fear and anticipation. A final, climactic moment occurred when an external force inadvertently intruded. A neighbor, compelled by rumor and curiosity, attempted to approach the property. The fog concealed them initially, but movement was detected. Cranston's followers responded instantly, not with aggression, but with a psychological assertion of boundary. The group's movement formed a human barricade, silent yet formidable, a living wall of cohesion and control. The intruder fled and the ritual continued uninterrupted, but the incident underscored the pervasive tension of the night. The cult existed in a fragile balance between internal discipline and external threat, each reinforcing the other in a crescendo of suspense and unease. By the early hours of dawn, the ritual concluded. Members slowly emerged from coffins, faces pale but composed, movements deliberate as though stepping out of a shared trance. The atmosphere remained thick with the residue of concentrated human will, fear, and ritual intensity. The town, which had been watching from the periphery, was left shaken. Parents whispered anxiously, journalists recorded with trembling hands, and clergy contemplated the theological and moral implications. The psychological imprint of the night was indelible. The tension, discipline, and subtle terror of the ritual had left an impression that would endure far beyond the immediate events. This climax, the apex of the cult's ritualistic discipline, demonstrates the interplay of ordinary human behavior with extreme environmental and psychological conditions. Fear, obedience, ritual, and observation converged to create a sustained narrative of suspense. The human mind, confronted with coordinated control, symbolic death, and collective focus, experienced heightened tension and cognitive dissonance. Observers were entranced yet horrified. Participants were committed yet tested. The community witnessed the power of belief manifested through physical and psychological orchestration. By the conclusion, the night's events had transcended mere ritual. They became legend, recorded in private journals, whispered among neighbors, and preserved in cautious newspaper accounts. The combination of human discipline, symbolic mortality, and the subtle psychological manipulation of collective focus created an experience of horror that was silent, yet profoundly enduring, a climax of human ritual that tested the limits of perception, fear, and devotion. As dawn broke over the frost-covered fields of rural Illinois, the ritual concluded, yet its effects lingered long after the followers had returned to daily life. The Cranston property appeared outwardly normal, wooden structures intact, the fog lifting, birds singing in the cold morning air. Yet an invisible tension permeated the town, a psychological residue of what had occurred within the walls the night before. Families whispered cautiously about the events they had glimpsed or heard, speculating on the limits of human devotion and the meaning of a life disciplined around nightly rituals and coffins. Even those who had not witnessed the ceremonies felt the subtle impact, an undercurrent of unease that altered the rhythm of daily routines. Within the cult, life returned to a measured calm, though the experience of the night's climax had fundamentally altered perceptions. Followers reported dreams of confinement and transcendence, often blurring reality and imagination. Some described heightened awareness of their own mortality, a reflective engagement with the fragility of life that carried over into everyday interactions. Yet others, particularly newer members, experienced lingering anxiety or physiological strain, a reminder that extreme ritual, even when embraced voluntarily, exerts profound influence on mind and body. Cranston himself remained a figure of quiet authority, guiding reflection without overt interference, allowing the lessons of the night to settle subtly into each follower's consciousness. The broader community responded with an uneasy mixture of awe, fear, and speculation. Neighbors continued to pass the property cautiously, sharing stories that blended observation with myth. Some families moved away entirely, unsettled by the invisible tension of the cult's presence. Others became curious, watching from a distance, drawn to the allure of the unexplained. Townspeople struggled to reconcile ordinary life with the extraordinary practices that had quietly persisted among them, highlighting a complex interplay between human curiosity, fear, and social boundaries. Journalists, historians, and psychologists, who later documented the events, offered interpretations that deepened the mystery. Reports emphasized the ritual's subtle power, noting how silent obedience and collective focus could create an atmosphere of psychological intensity. Observers speculated on the neurological and social effects of sleeping in coffins, considering disrupted circadian rhythms, altered perception, and the psychological reinforcement of obedience through confinement. Even decades later, these analyses were incomplete. The human mind had been engaged in ways that defied simple explanation, and the ritual's resonance extended beyond the immediate participants to affect the consciousness of all who knew or imagined them. The phenomenon raised questions about mortality, devotion, and the boundaries between fear and faith. Did the followers experience spiritual awakening, or had they been drawn into a psychological trap from which the mind could not fully escape? Was Cranston a visionary, a manipulator, or something in between? Local legends grew as stories of the coffins and nocturnal rituals were retold with varying degrees of embellishment. Children whispered of shadows moving in the barns, adults recalled the hypnotic precision of the ceremonies, and outsiders speculated endlessly about the limits of human endurance and the strange allure of the macabre. Medical and psychological. Observers noted subtle long-term effects on participants, heightened vigilance, altered sleep patterns, and in some cases, lasting emotional intensity. Yet these outcomes were often framed as both terrifying and extraordinary, a testament to the human capacity to endure, adapt, and find meaning in extreme circumstances. The cult's quiet persistence emphasized the interplay of voluntary ritual and subtle control, the way that devotion can intersect with discipline to produce outcomes that seem almost supernatural in their psychological impact. Even after the cult dissolved in later years, its legacy persisted. The property eventually returned to ordinary ownership, barns were repurposed, and coffins removed or repurposed, but the stories remained embedded in local consciousness. Oral histories preserve the memory of the nocturnal rituals, the eerie calm of followers, and the enigmatic authority of Elias Cranston. Scholars examining the accounts noted the enduring fascination. The combination of human discipline, symbolic mortality, and subtle horror creates a narrative that transcends time, continuing to provoke reflection and unease. The epilogue leaves unanswered questions. Were the rituals ultimately beneficial, spiritually or psychologically, to the participants? Did they experience genuine enlightenment, or had their consciousness been subtly reshaped by fear and repetition? Was Elias Cranston a figure of insight or manipulation, guiding his followers toward clarity or merely into the depths of controlled obsession? These questions remain unresolved, offering fertile ground for speculation, analysis, and storytelling. In reflection, the story of the cult that slept in coffins illustrates the delicate interplay between human belief, social context, and psychological influence. It reminds us that horror need not be overt or violent. It can exist quietly, embedded in ritual, discipline, and the subtle tension between life and symbolic death. The tale persists not because of spectacle, but because of its resonance with fundamental human experiences: mortality, fear, curiosity, and the desire for meaning. The silence, the precision, and the commitment of the followers leave an indelible impression, an unsettling legacy that continues to haunt those who encounter it, even decades later. The narrative concludes with this quiet, reflective horror. The world continues around the site, yet in memory and legend, the coffins remain, the shadows persist, and the questions endure, an eternal testament to the strange, haunting allure of human devotion and the power of subtle terror to shape thought, culture, and memory.